I read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, so you don't have to. That being said, this is more fun than educational, so if you're here because you have an essay on Frankenstein due at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night, Godspeed. We have our wall of characters and important events here, which is inspired by Carrie Can Read's Crescent City recaps, so shout out to her. Those helped me a lot before the third book came out. And this is a lot to take in, so I'm just gonna start explaining and we'll learn as we go. So, our book opens with Walton. That's him. I don't know if you can see him. There's a glare. We think his first name is Robert. It's unclear though, but hence Pattinson. And he's writing letters to his sister about his travels, sailing the world, trying to reach the North Pole. But him and his crew get stuck in ice at sea, and they see a large, strange man being pulled on a sled by dogs. And then the next morning, Walton and his crew rescue a man on a similar sled who is on the verge of death from frostbite. And Walton brings him on board to try and heal him. And it's important to note at this point that Walton is desperate for friendship. So he's excited about this strange man. And he asks this man what he's doing so far from land. And the man says he's looking for someone also using a dog sled. And Walton and his crew are like, hey, we might have seen him. And then this man becomes obsessed with trying to find the other man. Can we guess who the man is? Walton and this man quickly grow very close, and this man finally decides to tell Walton his story of how he got here on this boat in the middle of the ocean, starting with his childhood in the Frankenstein home. Throughout all this, Walton is having like the least heterosexual thoughts ever, but I think men in the 1800s were just like surprisingly more open with their emotions. The rest of the story is told through Frankenstein recounting his life to Walton. And Frankenstein actually had a really normal, good childhood in Geneva, Switzerland. His parents, over here, loved each other and they loved him. It's all you can ask for, really. His mother was very charitable and kind, and when Victor was a child, she adopted a girl around his age from a family that was living in poverty that had too many kids, I guess. And that is Elizabeth. And Victor treated Elizabeth like family growing up. They referred to each other as cousins. And almost a decade later, Victor's brothers were born. This is William. There is also Ernest, but Ernest is pretty irrelevant to this entire story, so he doesn't get a photo on the wall. But this is William. Again, not sure if you can see him. It is the actor who plays William on The Crown. Yeah. Frankenstein, from an early age, was hungry for knowledge. He was super interested in natural philosophy, specifically giving life to things. His father kind of brushed off his interests, which only made him want to pursue them more. You know how kids are. But then lightning struck a tree one day, and he decided that he could never know anything, which relatable, and took a brief break from his necromancy fantasies. Then he was set to go abroad to study in Germany when Elizabeth fell very ill, and his mother worked on nursing her back to health, but in turn she died instead. We have our first death of the book. There will be plenty more. So this is kind of Frankenstein's trauma number 1, and he does still end up going abroad to university just like a little bit later. So at school, he meets 2 professors who work in natural philosophy. Frankenstein is very skeptical of their work at first because, as we know, lightning struck a tree and he lost all hope. One of them, Mr. Kremp, solidified this skepticism because he made fun of Victor for spending years studying outdated philosophers. But then he met Mr. Waldman, who focused on chemistry and kindly suggested texts that Frankenstein could study that put him right back on the necromancy train. These 2 are kind of irrelevant for the rest of the story, and they give me rat energy, hence the image. So, Frankenstein becomes focused on the principles of life, and he studied human anatomy and physiology to examine the causes of life, all while swearing that he is not a madman, which I think he's trying to convince himself more than us. Frankenstein becomes obsessed with trying to give life to inanimate things, and he actually figures out how to. Don't know how he did that. We'll never know how he did that. That is not at all explained in this book. So he spent years locked up in his apartment, building a creature to give life to from scratch. He was so excited by his discovery that he decided to make something greater than human, 8 feet tall and broad and veiny. He wanted a species that would owe him gratitude for creating them. So that's normal. And then after many sleepless nights dedicated to his work, Frankenstein's creation finally opened its eyes. Victor admired its beauty for a minute before promptly reeling in horror at what he had done, saying, "But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream had vanished. Breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." And yes, this is Cole Sprouse. It felt right. So Frankenstein closes the door to his lab and he just tries to go to sleep. But he's awoke by the creature staring at him with bright yellow eyes, and he somehow just seemed to think the monster would not learn how to open the door from his lab. So he's surprised when he wakes up and sees the creature staring at him. So he flees his apartment and wanders into the city, regretting everything he's ever done. I guess. His specific thoughts were, "I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe." So this will be an ongoing theme throughout this book. Frankenstein, he's a dramatic guy. So when he's in the city, he runs into an old childhood friend, Henry Clerval. I don't think I need to explain why I picked this photo. Who had finally convinced his family to let him study abroad with Victor. But the joy Frankenstein feels at seeing him is short-lived, as reality just continuously crashes into him because he made this. He made this thing. And on top of that, Henry let him know that his family was upset by his lack of communication over the past few years because he was just completely isolated, solely focused on this. So Henry immediately notices there's something off with Frankenstein. But Victor doesn't want to tell him about his creation for good reason, and he takes Henry back to his apartment and tells him to wait downstairs while he goes up to check on the creature. He finds his apartment empty and feels immense relief because the monster is gone, and I guess he just doesn't think that that will ever come back to bite him. So Victor immediately falls into a slight madness as the past few years kind of catch up to him, and Henry ends up spending months nursing him back to health. He's probably suffering from like depression or something. It's referred to as a nervous fever very often throughout this book, which is just generally any strong emotion or mental illness in the 1800s. While he's in the peak of his unwellness, he receives a letter from his sister Elizabeth detailing the misfortune of a family friend, Justine. That's her. She's alone. And begging Frankenstein to write her and their family back so they can feel some sense of peace because they really didn't know what was going on with him. They were only hearing from Henry. So she shares that Justine was forced to return home to her abusive mother to care for her as she was sick after all of Justine's siblings had died. Her mother blamed Justine for their deaths, saying that because she treated Justine poorly, God killed all her other children. So her mom blames Justine for this. Elizabeth cares deeply for Justine and was happy when Justine returned to live with them after her mother's passing. So this may seem kind of irrelevant right now, but we need to remember Justine. So Frankenstein, when he's finally able to move around and leave the house again, introduces Henry to the university campus and basically does his best to avoid anything natural philosophy related because it now triggers him. He gets vastly uncomfortable when his professors try to sing his praises, and Henry does his best to shield Victor from anything that could trigger a relapse in his condition. So Victor is fully back to swearing off science and necromancy, hoping to live a more simple life from now on. Victor finally writes back to his family and is finally starting to feel joy again. He still doesn't seem to care where the creature went, and he receives a letter from his father informing him that his younger brother William has been murdered. Death number 2. So Victor arranges to go home as soon as possible. On his trip home, Victor is slowed by a huge storm and sees a silhouette in the lightning of a very large man, and he knows immediately that this is the creature he created and believes that the creature was the one to kill William. He contemplates telling his family this, but he concludes that they will think he's insane if he does try to explain it, so he does not. When he returns home, his family is wretched, aka sad, but they use the word wretched a lot in this book, and they inform him that Justine is the one on trial for William's murder. So Victor immediately believes she's innocent because he is certain the monster did it, and Elizabeth also believes that Justine is innocent because Justine has always been nothing but warm and kind to her. However, irrefutable evidence is presented at the trial, including a necklace that was stolen from William's body the night he was murdered and then found in Justine's pocket of her cloak. So the jury, or whatever it was called in 1818, finds her guilty. And the next day she is executed. Told you we need to remember Justine. So Victor, absolutely racked with guilt for creating the being that killed William, and by association, Justine, thinking William and Justine the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. So at least he's becoming self-aware. He returns to a shell of himself and goes on a trip to the mountains because he believes that this will help relieve some of his sadness. And the nature landscapes bring him somewhat of a sense of peace until one misty day on top of the mountain he is confronted by his creation. Victor viciously calls out the creature, blaming it for William's murder and all the misfortunes of his life. The monster doesn't immediately admit to killing anyone, but says, well, it started as a benevolent and good soul. Loneliness and rejection have made it a fiend. It asks for Frankenstein to hear its story, and if he still feels fit after, he can destroy it. All he originally wanted was affection from his creator. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice, and even thy clemency and affection, is most do. So the monster begins his 50-page monologue here, telling us a story about how he was overwhelmed and terrified when he was first given life. His senses were indistinguishable and he didn't know what he was or where he was, so he fled. And he spent months in the woods, slowly learned what each sense was, and discovered that berries helped pangs in his stomach and water from streams quenched his thirst. One night, he discovered fire and learned that it kept him warm, but it turned to pain if he got too close. He wore a cloak that he stole from Frankenstein to protect him from the harshness of the winter and continued his journey in an attempt to find shelter. He stumbled across a hut one day and entered to find a man eating his breakfast of bread and cheese. And the man ran away screaming, and the creature finished eating his breakfast. And he decided it was better than anything he had ever had before, so he went into town to try and find more, but the second he tried to enter a house, for obvious reasons, the townspeople attacked him in anger and fear. So the creature fled, and he found safety in a little hovel. Where's the hovel? There's the hovel, which is a small, unpleasant, and simply constructed shelter. This hovel was next to a cottage, so it kept him kind of warm, but still hidden from sight. And while he was in this hovel, he found a small hole in the side of the wall of the cottage, and observed 3 people in the cottage with great curiosity. He soon learned that they were a family, the DeLacy family, father, his daughter Agatha, and his son Felix, and that these 3 had a way to communicate their thoughts and feelings. This was all very new to the creature. So he could sense a sadness over these people, and he strived to pick up on their language so he could learn why. He grew very attached to them, even helping collect wood and food for them at night and leaving it by the cottage. Slowly, he picked up on their language, and his learning rapidly increased when Sophie, over here, visited the cottage, and Felix and Agatha started teaching her their language. The monster followed along closely with their lessons and practiced at night under the stars. He didn't dare leave during the day because he remembered the way the humans had treated him last time. So he spends most of his time in this hovel. Once, he caught a reflection of himself in the pond, and he was horrified by what he saw. He wanted to be a part of this family that he had grown to care for, but he knew that they would fear him. He often referred to these people as his protectors because he dreamed that one day they would accept him, saying that my heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. He hoped learning their language would help them look past his appearance, and this also sparked questions for him of what he was, because he'd never seen anything like him in the world, and he didn't recall ever being smaller like human children are. The creature, while watching through this little peephole, soon learned the history of his protectors. Sophie's father had been set to be executed when Felix helped him escape, and in return, Sophie's father promised Sophie's hand in marriage to Felix. And then while they were on the run from the French government, Sophie and Felix did fall in love. But Felix soon discovered that the French government had taken his family, so he returned in an attempt to free them, but instead, that did not work. They all spent 5 months in prison. And while they were in prison, Sophie's father tried to hide her away because he abhorred her marrying a Christian. Are we following here? Felix and Agatha and their father were exiled to a little cottage in Germany, which is where they currently live. Sophie was outraged to hear about their fate because she loved Felix, and she escaped from her father and traveled to Germany to be with them. So the monster was very moved and very impressed by this story of love and hardship. And this time, the creature also found some books to read. I think it was the Bible and maybe other things, I don't know, but there are references to the Bible. He learned a lot about human nature and history, and he felt envy reading about Adam, God's perfect creation who was loved by his creator, while this creature was wretched and alone. He related most to Satan, but then Satan at least still had companions. This is kind of foreshadowing for his future. It is even so that the fallen angel becomes the malignant devil. He soon discovered Frankenstein's notes in the pocket of the cloak he had taken that described the process of giving him life, and he paused the story here to ask Frankenstein why he made him such a horrid creature. He's asking the real questions here. As the autumn passed, the creature had psyched himself up, worked up the courage to introduce himself to this family that he had grown so fond of. He decided that he would introduce himself to the father first because the father was blind and cannot judge him based on his appearance. So he knocked on the door one day when no one but Mr. DeLacy was home and pleaded him to hear his story and help him remove any prejudices that his family might have. But as he's talking to the father, all 3 of these children come home. Agatha faints, Sophie flees, and Felix hits him repeatedly with a stick. Completely heartbroken, the creature flees the cottage back to his hovel. He went into the woods that night and howled in despair. He felt anger at the family, at his creator, and generally at humanity. I bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees and spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. And can we blame him? He rested in the forest, and then decided to return to the cottage the next day day to try and reason with the father again. But when he returned to the cottage, he found it deserted. The family had left immediately, citing danger to their father. That was the last time that the creature ever saw his protectors. This was kind of his last straw, and that night he burned the cottage to the ground. He then vowed revenge on his creator, and using Frankenstein's notes as a guide, headed towards his hometown. On his journey, he felt nothing but sadness until the spring breeze and sun gave him a slight reprieve. In this time, he saw a human girl fall into a river, and he raced to save her from drowning, pulled her out, and saved her. But when her father saw him hovering over her, he shot the creature. This renewed his anger towards mankind and spurred him on his journey to Geneva, where Frankenstein's family lived. So once he arrived, he hid out in a park until nightfall, and there he saw a young boy. He thought he could befriend the boy because he was young enough to not have developed prejudices yet, but the boy screamed, calling him an ogre and informing him that his very powerful father, Frankenstein, would be hearing of this. The creature quickly realized then that this boy was important to Frankenstein and strangled him pretty much instantly. He then took the necklace off the boy and planted it on a sleeping girl in a nearby barn. This whole time, he hoped to find Victor. This pretty much ends the creature's story as he's telling it to Victor on top of this mountain, which leads up to him asking Frankenstein to create another monster so that he may have a companion, one that has his same defects, is the same species, believing that only she would accept him, which valid of him, honestly. Frankenstein says no at first, but gives in pretty quickly because he feels pretty kind of responsible for the pain the creature has been through, which he is. Also, the monster threatens him. He says, and I quote, "If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my arch enemy." So Victor returns home from the mountains to prepare his journey to create this new creature for the old creature. And when his father asks him if he would marry Elizabeth now to ease his melancholy, which Victor had always expected to marry her, even though they were raised as cousins, they're not technically related, and it's the 1800s. He wanted his marriage with Elizabeth to be a peaceful time, so he resolved first to fulfill his promise to the creature. Victor journeyed to England with his friend Henry, and they spent a few months there learning from some up-and-coming philosophers that could help him with his new creation. Henry was there because he wanted to help colonize places. So it is 1818, and the whole time that they're there, Victor feels strong to spare his situation because he does not want to bring another monster into this world. So him and Clerval ventured to Scotland to visit a friend, and Victor isolates himself on an island to finish his work. He's ready to grind on the second creature. And one night while working, he comes to the conclusion that while the first creature may have agreed to peace, the new one might not. Again, valid point from Frankenstein here. And even if they were to go live in isolation, they would have monster children, and that could be a danger to the entire human race. And Victor is like, hey, maybe I shouldn't do that. So he notices the creature watching him through the window, and in a fit of rage destroys all his work. The creature is angry, obviously, and he vows to ruin Victor's life, specifically threatening to be there on his wedding night. He also says one of the most badass lines ever, "Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful." Personally, I would have been more concerned by that, but Frankenstein is generally narcissistic, so he just doesn't think much of it. And the creature storms out, and Victor throws all of the work he had created on this new creature into the water, and he sails off in an unknown direction. His boat ends up docking in Ireland, where he is immediately accused of murder. The townspeople the night before had found the dead body of a young man, and witnesses saw someone leaving the scene of the crime in a boat that looked similar to one that Victor arrived in. So they bring Victor in to see this body so that they can kind of gauge his reaction, see if he's responsible for the murder or not. But the body is Henry. They really start dropping like flies at this point. This sends Frankenstein into another nervous fever, and he spends 2 months sick in their prison until his father visits him and he slowly begins to recover. He was put on trial for the murder but was pretty much immediately acquitted because witnesses could place him on his island that he was on. So he journeys home with his father, and soon after his return, he marries Elizabeth. Victor was certain that the creature was going to try and kill him on this night because he did threaten to be there. So when Elizabeth and him get to the inn that they're staying in that night, he stays up with a pistol ready to fight the creation, the monster. But instead, he hears Elizabeth scream from the other room, and he walks in to find her dead, strangled with the handprints of the monster. R.I.P. Elizabeth. I don't know why he was so sure that the creature was going to kill him and not Elizabeth, considering the track record of the creature killing everyone he loves, but again, narcissist. So Frankenstein rushes home to check on his father and brother, who thankfully are both still alive, brother being Ernest, not William. Ernest is not important, he's not on the wall. Sadly, after hearing the news of Elizabeth's death, his father dies days later, overwhelmed by grief. So now the creature has either actually killed or by association killed pretty much the entirety of everyone Frankenstein has ever loved. Again, Ernest, I think, is still alive. Frankenstein does not seem to care at all. So this death sends Victor into another nervous fever for months. When he awoke with a vengeance. He was dedicated to finding the being that ruined his life, and so he decided to share his entire story with a criminal judge of his town to try and apprehend this monster. The judge first tells Victor that if what he said was true, it's unlikely they could capture a monster that has superhuman abilities, which pisses Frankenstein off and makes him sound even more insane until the judge stops believing him completely, and so he vows to hunt the creature down himself, saying, "Revenge alone endowed me with strength and composure." So this brings us all the way back to the beginning and how Frankenstein ended up on Walton's ship. The creature made Frankenstein chase him through Arctic climates, knowing that it would take their toll on him and his health, and the monster left clues behind whenever he felt that Frankenstein might be losing the trail. He was just toying with him the entire time, pretty much. That's when Walton's ship picked Victor up. The boat remains stuck in ice for a few days, and Frankenstein is not getting any better. Walton's crew has asked him at this point to turn the ship around as soon as possible, abandoning their mission to find the North Pole. So he's pretty distressed because he does not want to give up on his ambition, but he feels that he must listen to his crew, and also because he really liked Frankenstein, and he seems to be on the verge of death. So with his remaining strength, Frankenstein begs Walton to finish his mission and kill the creature, and then Frankenstein dies. Walton is recounting all of this, Frankenstein's entire story, in letters to his sister when he hears a sound from the cabin where Victor's body is, and he goes to check it out and finds the creature hovering over Victor, expressing wretchedness and shame over everything that transpired between them. The creature tells Walton that he didn't want to do all of this, he didn't want to be evil, but he had no choice when he was shunned by mankind and his creator. He feels that he suffered far more than Frankenstein, but he felt no joy in taking all the lives of those closest to Frankenstein. So with Frankenstein dead, he says that he can finally find peace, and he plans to go far away from civilization and set himself on fire, so that there are no memories of him or Frankenstein. "He is dead who called me into being, and when I shall be no more, the very remembrance of us both will speedily vanish." So he bids Walton farewell and jumps out the boat window, heading north. And that is where the book ends. Now we can assume that the creature does also die. Took quite a hit here. Our only survivors really are Walton, the DeLacy family, I hope they're thriving, and the professors. I hope they're not thriving. So now that we know the actual very sad kind of plot of Frankenstein, what does all of this mean? Some of the main themes in this classic are the burden of knowledge and ambition, alienation and human connection, and just nature in general. The pursuit of knowledge is obviously at the heart of Frankenstein as Victor attempts to surge beyond human limits. Similarly, Robert is attempting to surpass previous human explorations by trying to reach the North Pole. Their excessive drive to succeed leads them to overlook the possible consequences of their actions, and we see Victor throughout the whole story struggle to take responsibility for his creation. Victor's obsessive hatred for the monster drives him to death, whereas Walton ultimately pulls back from his treacherous mission, having learned by Victor's example of how destructive the thirst for knowledge can be. Frankenstein's biggest mistake and crime is that he placed his ambition above all his responsibilities to other people. So throughout the book, all the tragedies are basically caused by Victor and the monster's lack of connection to either family or society. Victor's studies initially draw him away from human interaction. He doesn't write his family or his friends for years. And then the monster too is driven to vengeance because of his loneliness. So his only goal throughout this book is to make Victor as lonely as he is. The monster is forced into seclusion by his grotesque appearance, but by taking revenge, the monster ensures that he will never be accepted by human society, so he becomes the monster that man sees in him. Walton serves as the final confessor for both of them, and their tragic relationship is immortalized in Walton's letters to his sister. In confessing just before he dies, Victor escapes the stifling secrecy that has ruined his life. Likewise, the monster takes advantage of Walton's presence to forge one human connection, hoping desperately that at last someone will understand and empathize with his miserable existence. Frankenstein was written in the peak of Romanticism, which was an art movement that focused on the celebration of the individual and the glorification of nature. So the influence of nature on mood is evident throughout this entire book. But for Victor, the natural world's power to console him wanes as soon as he realizes that his creature will haunt him wherever he goes. He says near the end of the book, "The sight of what is beautiful in nature, or the study of what is excellent and sublime in the production of man, could always interest my heart. But I am a blasted tree." Reference. "The bolt has entered my soul, a miserable spectacle of wrecked humanity." So by the end, nature in the form of the Arctic desert functions simply as a symbolic backdrop for the primal struggle between Victor and the monster. That is all I have for you today. I hope you learned something, or that you were at least entertained. Class dismissed.